I now welcome Russell Jacoby to the stage. He's going to be talking on the warm Marxism of E.P. Thompson, and Russell is a professor in history at the University of California, Los Angeles, who has published widely in European and American intellectual history.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here at a function honoring Brian, whose work I've always treasured. And I should say it's not only in labor history, in intellectual history. I've used several times his Dissenting discourse, probably well out of print at this point. Anyway, I salute him, and I might say not only his productivity, his originality, and his breadth, but also his hair. I must say, I envy. And I seem to recall, since we're talking about E.P. Thompson here, that both Thompson and, maybe correct me, on their books have a picture of a cat. And do you have a picture of one of your books? I mean, Thompson has one that is cat. Maybe it's the daughter, but does Thompson have one of?
The Poverty Theory has a picture of his cat around his neck.
Right, he has a cat around his neck. Right. Okay. I should say I did, in terms of my own pessimism, I made a small effort just very recently, 2 years ago, to honor Brian at UCLA. There's a small Canadian Studies program, which I guess is not so surprising because half of Canada retires to Southern California, I believe. And I tried to get Brian to come as the selection, as the speaker for this. They have this honorary program. And I kept saying, Brian, labor history, major thinker. And they looked, this is Los Angeles, they looked at me, the Canadian Studies people were totally blank. I mean, they were looking for the cokehead mayor, I think. Toronto would come or something. I was not very successful.
He was down for Jimmy Kimmel.
Yes.
I have no formal paper here. I put together some remarks which deal with E.P. Thompson. And one might note that there's already in the title somewhat of a mixed metaphor, the old bustard, the warm Marxism. There's a problem here, and perhaps one could be called the ornery Marxism of E.P. Thompson. And yet I do want to speak about one part of his work, which does have to do with the warmth, the element of almost the soulfulness of the work of E.P. Thompson. And I'm drawing upon, and this bears on remarks, these terms of warm Marxism and the cold and warm streams of Marxism. Actually the terms come from the work of Ernst Bloch, the dissident German Marxist who had lived in East Germany and then fled to West Germany. He was in fact sometimes a Stalinist. He was always a utopian. And Bloch himself specified in the Principles of Hope that there was this warm stream of Marxism, utopian, dreamy, liberating, which in some sense was being set in opposition to a cold stream, which, well, science, economics, mechanics. And in some ways, I would like to argue or suggest that Thompson does belong in this warm stream, that he taps into the romantic critique of capitalism, a critique which taps into things about song, celebration, which has a soulful dimension to it. And in my judgment, this tradition, which certainly is not totally ignored, but basically has been too little attended, too much defamed. Thompson, to some degree, Raymond Williams in Culture and Society also represent this tradition. It points to a problem, I think, in Marxism itself, to the degree that Marxism saw itself, and I guess maybe continues to, as inheriting capitalism, inheriting its infrastructure, its mechanics, but changing the ownership, changing who gets, so to speak, the profits. The classic expression of this was Lenin's description of communism as Soviet power plus electrification. It was Soviet power plus electrification. This idea that somehow that communism, Marxism, would take the capitalist infrastructure and simply change the ownership of it. It would be for the benefit of the workers, or the benefit of everyone. And it seemed to me that tradition of Marxism, and I'd even suggest, and it's a little tricky, I don't know how it plays out in Canada, but the term which certainly continues to be used about the left is progressives. The left is a progressive. We are progressives in the sense that we inherit capitalism. We inherit its iPhones, its internets, its everything, and we change the ownership of it. And it seems to me that tradition of progressivism also tended to dampen some element of the critique of capitalist technology and the fabric of life and the rhythms of life that it produced. There were certainly some anarchists and some Marxists who set themselves against that. And this is what I'm calling the warm spring, perhaps the romantic tradition. A perfect representative of this in the English tradition was, of course, E.P. Thompson, and before him was William Morris. And to use the great Marxist phrase, it was no accident that E.P. Thompson's first real book, after the book, which I'll mention in a moment, on his brother, was a biography of William Morris. It was Morris who, I think, led Thompson out of the old left into the new left. And if you look at the first edition, in fact, which was published in 1955, of Thompson's book on Morris, it smacked of the old left. It included citations of Lenin and other quotations, which he later took out when it was republished 20 years later. And I might note that, the distance that Thompson himself traveled. He writes a memoir of his brother his memoir of his brother, who died when he was only 23. And he writes this book when E.P. Thompson is 23 as well. His brother was killed, as perhaps you know, as a partisan in Bulgaria. He was considered an extremely talented fellow. He spoke 10 languages. And in this memoir that E.P. Thompson writes of his brother, it sort of glows with old communism, the spirit. And the book closes describing a ceremony in 1947 in Bulgaria, which honors Frank Thompson. And the book closes describing the ceremony in which the Minister of Transport spoke at a railroad station, which was renamed in honor of Frank. And I assume it's still there. I don't know if anyone has taken the railroad in Bulgaria recently. Anyway, it closes with this ceremony describing this ceremony. And E.P. Thompson writes, quoting the minister, "Now by day and night," so this is E.P. Thompson, "now by day and night, the trains run past Major Thompson's station, fulfilling their quota of the 2-year plan, serving the minister's command to live, be happy, and create." And that's E.P. Thompson, who closes the memoir of his brother. That minister was later arrested as a fascist spy and vanishes. So in fact, E.P. Thompson moves from that kind of Marxism. And I think it is, this is not only an intellectual project, but it was William Morris which facilitated the move out of that into something else. And I could talk about Morris because obviously he's not unknown, but I think he still remains somewhat of a problematic figure. And in this sense, and it was mentioned earlier, that Thompson himself was a very proud member, and maybe one could even say a truculent member, a representative of English tradition, and of this kind of English Marxism. As perhaps as many of you know, that became an issue in the early years of the left between Thompson and that which he later called, I think, he referred to Perry Anderson and others as the angel of history or something, when they sent Thompson packing. And it is interesting to look at, in fact, New Left Review, we've had a treatment of labor earlier, over 50 years. And I note, looking through it and using some sort of search, that in 50 years, there's only one article which had William Morris in its title, which was E.P. Thompson's own 1976 postscript to the republication of his book. One article. And in some sense, which is part of the issue here, when I began with Ernst Bloch, is that the national traditions of Marxism remain incredibly durable and difficult to penetrate or permeate. What German Marxists, for instance, have ever written about William Morris? I think the answer is zero, probably. And this becomes the issue between Thompson and the New Left Review, that they disdained his kind of English provincialism, so they saw it, and turned towards French and Italian Marxism. And the famous Perry Anderson critique said, there was no, where were the English Marxists? Where was the Althusser? Where was the Gramsci? Where was the Lukács? Of course, there was William Morris. And I think it's fair, and if we're looking at 50 years of the magazine Labor, we can begin to take account here of the consequences. New Left Review ran scores of articles about Althusser. What, after all, is the consequences of it? What is the upshot of thousands of articles of Althusser and his anti-humanism? I would submit to you Very little. Very little, the consequence. That it has not proved to be a productive tradition. That has led to very little. More recently, Perry Anderson, who I might say is a colleague at UCLA, has written a withering attack on French intellectuals as provincial. But it could be said that they didn't fall so far because they were never so high. The notion that you know they had left the depths of Althusserian heights for something else. But I do think it is fair to look at the record here of what the Althusserian Marxists have produced over the decades compared to the Thompson Marxists, the Gutman Marxists. That what does the record show here? What are the works which we can look at and read and value? The Althusserians, I guess I should be careful, though I guess I'm basically a friendly crew here, are still exist. This is not America, so I don't need a bulletproof vest here, I guess. I'm not sure, right? Concealed weapons here. The Althusserians still exist, though of course they're a much diminished crowd. Very little is written, but one can find, I looked around, there's a new book on Althusser out. The first chapter, its title is Althusserians' Aleatory Materialism and the Challenge to the Teleological. Sounds, it's a must-buy. But I think looking over here that Thompson himself, represents something about the English tradition and English Marxism, which certainly deserves to be defended and upheld. And now looking at the record, then, although Perry Anderson and others did score some points here, the tradition of the French Marxists, and particularly the Althusserians, was not particularly promising. I say Thompson himself does defend the national tradition, with honor and with enthusiasm. He was a polemicist with a thin skin, I might say. He wrote at one point, and this is actually in his Morris article, "I would not wish to trade German philosophy and sociology for English poetry and moral criticism." I'm not sure, coming from a different direction, that's necessary, but again, I salute the idea here, at least the spirit. My title refers to the old bustard, and there was a question of changing it to the old bastard, which it's one letter away from, and it might be as appropriate. But Thompson himself compared himself more than once to the bustard. I don't know those of you who are the Audubon Society. I'm not familiar with the bird myself, at least according to Thompson. It's one of the heaviest birds and has difficulty flying.
It says bustards are large and highly terrestrial birds.
Terrestrial, right.
Terrestrial birds.
Okay. Anyway, Thompson himself identifies it as one of the heaviest birds and that flies with difficulty. It's interesting because it is one letter away from a bastard. And so Thompson himself says, he calls himself, he relates to the bustard and says, "I cannot fly. When you spread your wings," and this is in his, I believe, his letter to Kolakowski, "when you spread your wings and soar into the firmament where Kierkegaard and Husserl, Heidegger, jaspers and sark and the other great eagles soar, I remain on the ground. like one of the last of the great bustards, awaiting the extinction of my species on the diminishing soil of an eroding idiom, craning my neck into the air, flapping my paltry wings. All around me, my younger feathered cousins are turning into little eagles and whirl. They're off to Paris, to Rome, to California. I thought of trying to join them. I've been practicing the words essence, conjuncture, problematic, sign, but my wings get no larger. If I try, I know very well that with my great bulk of romantic moralisms, my short-sighted empirical vision, and my stumpy wings, I would fall plop in the middle of the channel. I mean, this is Thompson at his best in certain ways. I don't totally follow him in his hostility to continental thought. On the other hand, I think basically history is on his side in terms of where the consequences of those traditions, in terms of the writing history, have been. That ultimately, let's say, you know, that it is the Thompson and the Gutman labor history, which has proved to be more fruitful and consequential than the Althusserian school. And one of the things which I frequently mention, and again, I have to be careful with my bulletproof vest, you know, one of the things which is sometimes said about, you know, who are the leading, you know, Marxists in America? And one of the answers is, you know, Fred Jameson, you know, leading Marxist. And you say, well, you know, Fred Jameson, you know, what is the work there? I mean, he's certainly very, you know, it's extensive, but it, you know, it's insular, it's technical, it's read in English departments. It's high theory for the high theorists. There's some people who have tried to break out of these national traditions. Michael Levy has been one, I think, who's written from a sort of a German tradition looking at romantic, and I guess he's half Brazilian, or totally Brazilian.
Totally Brazilian.
Yeah.
Who has tried to break out some of these national traditions. But they remain, in many ways, very strong. Thompson himself, I think, yes, is a great representative of it. He was a proud English Marxist. He was a moralist, which, you know, almost to a fault. In his letter to the Kolakowski, he said he won't go on vacations in Spain because, you know, it's the tradition of Franco. He won't go to Ford Foundation funded events. And I might add, for this crowd, he said he never goes to a left-wing conference without paying for it.
Hear, hear.
I think the spirit of Thompson, as well as the work, that is this kind of warm Marxism, you know, has much to offer, and that there is the danger of the scientific tradition, which sees Marxism as taking over capitalism. Again, you know, Soviet power plus electrification. You know, the Marxists, the progressives, we inherit the technology. We sort of, you know, we take the iPads and, you know, we give them to a different part of the population. It may not be that simple. In this way, I think that the old bustard or the old bastard, you know, helps us understand something about the dynamics of capitalism. Thank you.